In the United States, there were several railroads that captured the hearts and minds of rail fans throughout history. Whenever it was quirky equipment, a long-standing rivalry, or a railroad that made history, each one has had their stories told on how they became to be beloved. For Western railroads like the Southern Pacific, Union Pacific, and Santa Fe, they had a rivalry to and from the West Coast, with the Southern Pacific and Union Pacific railroads also having special equipment, with the SP having the cab forwards and the UP with the big boys, while the Santa Fe has become one of the most famous railroads to operate in the Southwest, especially with its extremely famous passenger train, the Super Chief. In the East, railroads like the Baltimore and Ohio have claimed to fame for being the oldest railroad in existence during its time, the Norfolk and Western for running steam till 1960, and the New York Central's and Pennsylvania Railroad's well-known rivalry between each other to compete for the best passenger and freight service between Chicago and New York City. And in the Midwest, there were some famous railroads as well, including the Chicago, Burlington and Quincy, Chicago and Northwestern, and of course, the Rock Island. But all of these railroads had one thing in common. They were all Class 1s and had tracks stretching to several states. But one railroad, in fact, was quite special, especially in the state it operated in. For 125 years, Indiana was home to a Class 1 that had no tracks outside of its state, and had to use trackage rights on other railroads into Chicago and Louisville. This railroad's nickname came from the Indian word for swift running, as well as the town on where its four major lines intersected with each other. Its nickname was Monon, a nickname for the Chicago, Indianapolis, and Louisville Railroad. A railroad who was the first to dieselize entirely, used two special color palettes from the colleges they served, and was one of the several railroads with John W. Barringer III as president. This is how, despite its size, the Monon was able to change the lives of Indiana, how John W. Barringer saved it after World War II, and why many people still call it the Hoosier Line, as we look at one of the most overlooked railroads in the United States. The Monon Story, today on Michael's Railworld. In the 21st century, the town of Monon, Indiana hasn't changed as much as it did back then. While small, its growth was due in thanks by the railroad. CSX Transportation operates most of the former Monon Railroad handling freight, while Amtrak operates passenger services on other sections of the line. While some sections of the old Monon right-of-way were converted to walking trails, some parts of the railroad have been left abandoned, and its equipment, both rolling stock and motive power, have been scattered to the winds to various museums and collections, from the railroad's first diesel switcher, DS-50, to one of the few railroads that were the first to buy a quirky diesel locomotive from EMD, the BL-2s. The Monon Railroad had a charm that many people in Indiana still remember fondly of when it was in active service. In a span of 125 years, the Monon Railroad was able to transform the lives of rural Indiana and showed that, with proper management, even a small railroad could bounce back from financial ruins, as John W. Barringer III was able to do as the Monon's president between 1946 to 1952. But in order to learn more on how the Monon was able to bounce back from oblivion, let's go back on how the Monon Railroad came into being in the first place. As America crossed the Appalachian Mountains and into the new frontier of the Midwest, they found that with its fertile soil, farming would be a big industry. Soon enough, farms producing crops to livestock peppered the landscape. While this was good, transportation was another matter. Since the railroads needed to plan extensions into the Midwest, people who wanted to travel and farmers who needed their farm goods brought to market had to either use a horse and cart, ride horseback, or even walk. There was riverboat operations along the Ohio River, but when the ice came, the boats were stuck. That was soon to change, as in 1847, Indiana got a railroad company by the name of the New Albany and Salem, with its founder of the company, James Brooks, as the road's first president. The railroad began to operate its first trains, helping the population of Indiana by bringing towns closer together and bringing fresher goods from the farms and various industries to market. By 1852, the NA&S trackage stretched from the Ohio River at New Albany to Lake Michigan and Michigan City via the Michigan Central Railroad, as it was hoped that Michigan City would become a busy port town, as it sat near the Great Lakes. But, however, it didn't happen, as Chicago took that role, and the city didn't become much of a railroad town either. 5 years after the extension, the railroad was facing financial issues due to expanding the railroad too fast, which forced the railroad company to be reorganized, and the name was changed to the Louisville, New Albany, and Chicago Railroad. The L&A&C Railroad was able to help during the Civil War by transporting troops and supplies to the front lines. In fact, a railroad bridge and station in Salem was attacked, resulting in the railroad stopping services for over a week. By 1865, with the war over, the railroad would carry one of two famous people over its system, as it became one of the railroads to handle the funeral train of President Abraham Lincoln, as it took the funeral train and the special coach containing the president's coffin to Michigan City, on where the train was put onto a Michigan Central Railroad train bound for Chicago. By 1873, with financial problems again, the railroad was once again reorganized as the Louisville, New Albany, and Chicago Railway, and stayed like that until 1897. When it was renamed to the Chicago, Indianapolis, and Louisville Railway. As the railroad was renamed to the CI&L, the railroad's receiver, a one W.H. McDowell, would actually be one of three people that helped the railroad stay profitable for several years. During the McDowell era, as it was known, a new freight yard was built in Bloomington, which was named in his honor, and the other was the construction of the railroad's own shop complex in Lafayette, which in later years was to help refurbish ex-U.S. Army hospital cars into passenger cars to match its new diesel engines. And speaking of motive power, during the steam era on the CI&L, the railroad's steam locomotive roster was similar to those on other railroads across the country, with small 060 switchers to the largest on their fleet, 210-2 Santa Fe types. Though the railroad also operated 442 Atlantics and 462 Pacifics on its passenger trains, with 280 Consolidations, 282 Mikados, and 480 Mastodons hauling freight, with the CI&L being one of the few railroads other than the Norfolk and Western that actually employed the 480 type. Along with 460 10-wheelers and 440 Americans, the CI&L steam roster wasn't anything special, though the railroad's design engineers came up with two proposals for two new types of engines, one being an articulated design, and the other, if it had been built, would have made the Chicago, Indianapolis, and Louisville a railroad with quirky equipment, as that other design was a 410-4 type, which, if been built, would have been known as a Monon class. Neither happened, and the railroad's last steam engines acquired by the railroad were heavy 282 Mikados. The CI&L's southern point was in Louisville, Kentucky, on where the Monon met several southern railroads, including the Louisville and Nashville and the Southern, and its northern point was up in Chicago via trackage rides on the Chicago and Western Illinois into Dearborn Station, where the CI&L met up with several railroads that had southern, eastern, and western destinations, as the station held up to several different railroad companies, including the Monon. The CI&L's main source of freight revenue came by serving the various coal mines, as well as bringing in hoppers of coal from the Southern and Louisville and Nashville. The railroad also served several limestone quarries, but the tonnages were more than the revenue it earned, and despite the railroad being in a state where crops like corn were plentiful, those crops didn't make much money as hauling coal did. And with it just running one state, the CI&L became sort of a bridge line that had several interchanges with tons of different railroads. The improvements made by the McDowell era gave the CI&L a solid financial step at the turn of the 20th century. And with the Depression, the railroad was hit hard, though in 1932 it also carried another famous figure. As one of the most famous gangsters during the Prohibition period, Al Capone, who had made millions of selling illegal booze and withholding his taxes, boarded the CI&L's Dixie Flyer to be taken to the Atlanta State Federal Penitentiary. Also in that year, the CI&L donated a steam locomotive to Bell to be used as a trophy at a football game between DePaul University and Wabash College, giving it the nickname the Monon Bell. Despite that though, the Depression finally caused the CI&L to enter bankruptcy the next year. And with it even during World War II, the railroad was basically needing very much financial assistance. A year after World War II ended, the CI&L was reorganized again by Chicago's federal court, being the Chicago, Indianapolis, and Louisville Railroad. And they would basically elect one man that would actually help the Monon Railroad enter a new age of prosperity and growth that hadn't been seen since the era of Big Gold. John W. Barringer III had been known in the railroad industry for many years, as he had handled the Reconstruction Finance Corporation between 1933 and 1941, and would actually be the one man that would bring Fairbanks Morris into the diesel locomotive market. John Barringer took over the Monon Railroad from L. F. D. Ramus, and said that the Monon would be a guinea pig for his super railroad concept. After World War II, the railroads were starting to see that diesels were cheaper to operate than steam locomotives, which eventually caused the railroad age to enter the transition period, where both steam and diesel power worked alongside each other. The CI&L, however, wasn't new to diesels, as the railroad actually purchased its first diesel switcher, DS-50, an EMD SW1 in 1942. But John Barringer pushed an aggressive modernization plan for the railroad, and made orders with EMD for new road power. The railroad was originally planned to have both E7 and F3 diesels, with them working on the passenger and freight trains respectively. But however, considering the railroad's track work at the time, the railroad decided to primarily invest in F3s, with some of them to be fitted with equipment to operate on the passenger trains. However, when they arrived on the railroad, the passenger trains were still Pullman heavyweights from the steam era, and they looked a little bit out of place with the more modern F units. The Monon knew that placing orders for new passenger equipment would take 2 to 3 years, as the passenger car manufacturer had a huge backlog of orders. But luck was however shining upon them, as the railroad was able to buy 28 U.S. Army hospital cars, and were quickly brought to the Monon shops in Lafayette, where they were completely converted from carrying and treating wounded soldiers to providing passenger comfort. At the same time, the railroad was coming up with 2 new paint schemes for its equipment. They decided to choose the colors of Indiana University and Wabash College of red and gray to be used on the railroad's passenger trains, while the colors of DePaul and Purdue University's black and gold would be used on the railroad's freight and mixed traffic locomotives, as well as on the passenger cars in later years. In 1947, the railroad's 100th anniversary was approaching, and the railroad planned a special event. The railroad was able to borrow the Baltimore and Ohio's William Mason, a 440 American type, to be used on the railroad's historical train, while being tagged behind by one of the railroad's newest diesel locomotives, an Alco RS-2. Both the William Mason and the RS-2 traveled all the way to New Albany, on where both the diesel and the steam engine were put on display. The Southern Railway even joined in with the railroad's replica of the first passenger steam engine to operate in the United States, the Best Friend of Charleston. Over 100,000 people came to the event, and soon enough, a pair of F3 diesels painted in the railroad's new passenger red and gray livery pulled in with the railroad's new passenger cars, signaling a new era for the Monon Railroad. And on August 17, 1947, the railroad began the rebranded and re-streamlined Tippecanoe service, and that evening, when the train was turned around, it became the first run of the newly re-equipped Hoosier. But this was due to the lack of equipment for unknown consist. But by November, they were able to get another set ready, allowing the Tippecanoe and the Hoosier to operate with new passenger cars. However, as America took to the skies and the roads, the full potential of the new passenger cars were never realized. But the Monon knew they had a strong suit in freight service. But as for the people that rode on them at the time, it was comfortable and smooth along the Monon's right of way. The railroad also offered special services to allow passengers to travel to the Indy 500 and the Kentucky Derby. And since the railroad also chose the college's colors, the railroad basically retained pride and recognition, as it was nicknamed the Hoosier Line. As for the railroad's diesel power, as it grew, the steam engines began to be retired and sold for scrap. And by 1949, there was only one steam engine left in service, 060 Switcher number 35, which was renumbered to 95 in 1947. And by June 28th of 1949, number 95 was finally retired from service, making the Monon the first railroad and the first Class 1 railroad to dieselize completely. The railroad's diesels, just like the steam engines, were nothing special, as it had diesel engines that other railroads would eventually operate at the time. Other than the Alco RS2s and F3s, the railroad also had the second highest amount of an unusual diesel from EMD called the BL2, which, when it was not handling a passenger train or a freight train, could be used as a road switcher. The railroad also, thanks to John Behringer, would also have the arrival of several Fairbanks Morris diesels, including a singular H1044 switcher and a pair of H1544 road switchers. The railroad would also have a fleet of C628s and C420s, both in high and low hood variants, with the latter normally used in passenger service, and U-23Bs. The Monon Railroad was also a test bed for the Budd Company's self-propelled rail cars, known as the RTCs, as it was used on a test service between Bloomington and Monon in April of 1950. But after a 2-week period, the Monon declined to buy one. Because of the quick change from steam to diesel, the railroad was able to pay its dividends between 1946 and 57, as the cheaper cost of operating diesels was basically apparent. To say the railroad had a spring in its step was very much true, as the improvements helped the Monon blossom, and it was ready to take on the new decade in confidence. In 1952, John Behringer left the Monon to work on several other railroads, including a vice presidency position on the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad. His successor, Warren W. Brown, now had to handle the railroad that John Behringer left behind. As by 1956, the railroad fully adopted its nickname, Monon, as its corporate title. At the same time with the passing of the Federal Highway Act and the airline industry awaiting the upcoming jet airliners. Since the 1950s, the Monon's passenger ridership continued to fall, and by 1959, the railroad discontinued its passenger services between Chicago and Indianapolis. And since the company decided passenger trains weren't going to last much longer, the railroad decided to make the colors of DePaul and Purdue University black and gold to basically become the company's standard. The discontinued passenger service between Chicago and Indianapolis, this only left one passenger train left in operation, and it operated the route between Chicago and Louisville, with that service being known as the Thoroughbred. However, with only an average of 63 passengers, the only thing it kept it in service was its contract with the U.S. Postal Service. But when the contract was pulled, the final nail in the coffin for the railroad's passenger trains came, and on September 29, 1967, the railroad ran its final passenger train, as Highfoot C420 number 502 was in charge of its last run. The media covered the entirety of the event, and once the train arrived at its final destination, the era of passenger service on the Monon had came to a close, as after that, the Monon now became a freight-only railroad. However, 3 years prior to the event, the railroad was able to have 20% of stock purchased on America's last interurban railroad, the Chicago, South Shore, and South Bend, with the hopes they basically can have trackage rights over the interurban to access the harbors and the large steel mill to increase freight numbers. However, that plan didn't go through, and soon enough, the L&N took acquisition of the nearby Chicago and Eastern Illinois Railroad, causing the Monon to go into a panic.
Oh, no.
Eventually, the L&N announced a merger with the Hoosier Line, and on July 31st, 1971, the Monon was merged with the L&N, ending 125 years of service to the state of Indiana. The tracks of the now former Monon Railroad became the Monon division of the L&N, and soon enough the trackage became under the ownership of the family lines by 1982. And by 1986, all the Monon track that was still left in operation was taken over by the CSX Corporation. Today, most of the original Monon trackage has been removed either by the family lines or CSX as traffic declined before the railroads were deregulated. But most portions of the Monon right-of-way were kept in operation for freight service, and in some areas, passenger service by Amtrak. So the tracks of the Hoosier Line are still being used by both freight and passenger trains over 40 years later. Although John Barringer hoped for a rise in passenger numbers with the new passenger equipment, this came at a time when the US slowly but surely transferred to the roads or skies, and as a result, with the passenger service being discontinued in 1967, most of the passenger cars were either sold off to new owners or sold for scrap. However, 5 business cars and a mail and baggage car were able to find new homes and preservation, with most of them being repainted for another railroad. Several cabooses and freight cars and other pieces of rail equipment also received new homes after being retired from mainstream service. As for motive power, that has been limited. For diesels, one of the railroad's BL2s, number 32, is operational at the Kentucky Railroad Museum, wearing its Purdue and DePaul colors of black and gold. One of the railroad's modern diesels by 1960 standards, number 517, a C420, worked on the L&N for several years before being sold to various owners, until arriving at its current home at Northampton Development Center's Railroad as number 2034, and it's still owned by the NDC as of 2023. And finally, the railroad's first diesel switcher, DS50, would eventually land in the ownership of the Indiana Transportation Museum in 1992, on which she was given repairs to make it operational, and was often used to primarily move equipment around the museum grounds. Unfortunately, the ITM soon lost the land it was on, and fearing the DS50 safety, as if it was left behind, it would be cut up for scrap, DS50 would be one of the first few pieces of equipment to be trucked out of the museum before the deadline. However, in a case of bad luck, on its way to be placed in temporary storage, the diesel's cab was decapitated as a truck that it was carrying it ran under a low bridge in 2018. Thankfully though, the Hoosier Valley Railroad Museum stated they wanted to get DS50 back into service as soon as possible once a replacement cab has been installed. Now, here's something you probably did not know. Although steam on the Monon was gone by 1949, you may think all of them have been scrapped. But there is actually one steam engine that actually survives today, and that one is number 504, one of the CI&L's J1 class Mikados built by the American Locomotive Company in the late 1900s. The engine was sold to the Sioux Line Railroad in 1941 and was renumbered to 1024, and after its retirement was put on static display in the town of Thief River Falls, Minnesota. It's surprising on how one steam engine from the Chicago, Indianapolis, and Louisville Railroad was able to survive the scrapper's torch by being sold to another railroad during World War II, with the Sioux Line saving it no less. Even as the world moves on, the spirit of the Monon still lives on by those who have seen it and or operated on its routes during its heyday. The Monon's history has also been able to be seen in virtual train simulators, as Rick Berg worked on a version of the Monon Railroad for Microsoft Train Simulator for over 10 years, recreating the era when the Monon was still a profitable railroad during its prime, as well as people making custom models and reskins of the Monon's equipment, ranging from the steamers and diesels to the passenger and freight car equipment, to give the train simmer a chance to see a railroad that has been gone in a long time in reality, but still exists in a simulated realm. Dining car chinaware, signs, and various pieces of Monon memorabilia have also been collected by those who want to preserve the Hoosier line for future generations. And to prove that even though the Mona was indeed a Class 1 despite its size, it was indeed a railroad that touched everyone in Connecticut, from its college colors on its diesel roster to a company that still has fans many years later. It is indeed worthy of being known as the Hoosier Line.
Feel the pulse of the wheel on the rail, on the rail, on the rail. Sing me a song of the rail. Carry me on to my dream.